Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight's show was suggested by David Sabbath. It's Nazis in the Antarctica. He's a long-time listener, and he gives them good suggestions on different shows. And if you've got a show you'd like to hear, you can send me the request, and I'll see if I can't put it out. First, my favorite writer of all time is Terry Pratchett. He was a unique and profuse writer, penning 71 books. He had a way of looking at life. Terry Pratchett said, "The pen is mightier than the sword if the sword is very short and the pen is very sharp." He also said, "This isn't life in the fast lane. It's life in the oncoming traffic." The first book I read by him was called Thud. It's about how the guards are trying to keep the peace on the Disc world by employing all manners of odd creatures. They have people like werewolves and vampires and trolls and dwarves, and the chief of police, or the chief of the guards, spends most of his time trying to get these people to stop fighting each other so they can fight crime. Very entertaining, but it'll make you think. Pratchett said, "Some humans would do anything to see if it was possible to do it. If you put a large switch in some cave somewhere with a sign on it saying, 'End of the world to switch. Please do not touch,' the paint wouldn't even have time to dry." He also said time is a drug, and too much of it kills you. Wisdom comes from experience. Experience is often a result of a lack of wisdom. Light thinks it travels faster than anything, but it is wrong. No matter how fast light travels, it finds the darkness has always got there first and is waiting for it. Every book Terry Pratchett wrote is available. You just have to look for it. It's Pratchett with 2 T's at the end. The hard part is getting them in order and then reading them that way. Oddly enough, his first few books received really bad ratings from the critics, which I've already discovered that most critics hate life, they hate themselves. That's why they say bad things about everybody. Terry Pratchett said you should always have a neighbor that deals in stolen goods, because fences make good neighbors. Like many other countries, Germany sent expeditions to Antarctica in the late 19th and 20th centuries, most of which were scientific. The late 19th century expedition to the Southern Ocean, South Georgia. The South Georgia is an island in the southern Atlantic Ocean that is part of the British Overseas Territory. The main settlement is Grytviken, which doesn't sound very British to me. The Germans also went to Krugland Island and the Crozet Islands. The Krugland Islands are also known as Desolation Islands. Sounds like a lovely place to visit. If you're going someplace called Desolation Islands, I think you booked the wrong trip. The expeditions were astronomical, meteorological, and hydrological. Most of the work was in close collaboration with scientific teams from other countries. As the 19th century ended, Germany began to focus on Antarctica. The first German expedition to Antarctica was the Gauss expedition from 1901 to 1903, led by Arctic veteran and geology professor Erich von Dragolsky. They sailed aboard a ship named the Gauss, which was named after the mathematician and physicist Carl Friedrich Gauss. This was the first expedition to use a hot air balloon in the Antarctica. It also found and named Kaiser Wilhelm II Land. Why do people insist on naming things after politicians? I don't understand. Most politicians are very happy getting things done for them, but they're not so happy about getting things done for those under them, at least in my opinion. The second German Antarctic expedition from 1911 to 1912 was led by Wilhelm Felchner, with a goal of crossing Antarctica to learn if it was one continuous piece of land or several islands all strung together. As happened with other such early attempts, the crossing failed before it even began. The expedition discovered and named the Litpold Coast and the Filchner Ice Shelf. Well, at least they didn't name that one after a politician. The Great War. The war to end all wars, as they called it. The U.S. called it the European conflict. Later on, it became known as World War I. Began in 1914, and it brought any further Arctic expeditions to a halt. Well, the Nazi Party began to grow in Germany and took over in 1933. July 1st, 1935, Heinrich Himmler organized a meeting at the Berlin headquarters of the SS, where he discussed his desire to launch a prehistoric research institute. Wirth and agriculturalist Richard Walther Dare were present, and both responded with enthusiasm to the idea. The group was launched as a department of Russia, that's R-U-S-H-A. Wirth became the group's president, while Himmler took the role of superintendent. This position entitled considerable control by placing him in charge of its boards and trustees. Its former goal was to promote the scientific, ancient historical history of the Germanic people. They were going to accomplish this by looking for only proof of German superiority and ignoring anything that might prove otherwise. Wirth was removed when his beliefs in Atlantis became too much for Himmler's taste. Himmler was looking more towards the Vikings as being their predecessors, but then he changed to looking for the Aryan race. In 1937, a German whaling fleet was put to sea, and upon its successful return in 1938, plans for a third German Antarctic expedition were begun. The third German Antarctic expedition was launched in 1938 and ran until 1939. The expedition was led by Alfred Reicher, who was a captain in the German Navy. The publicized purpose was to find an area in Antarctica for a German whaling station, as a way to increase Germany's production of fat. Whale oil was the most important raw material for the production of margarine and soap in Germany. Boy, you don't want to run out of soap. Their country was the second largest purchaser of Norwegian whale oil, importing some 200,000 metric tons a year. Besides being dependent on imports, Germany thought there was a very real probability they would soon be going to war. At the end of the Great War, just about every country looked at building a peaceful existence. They pretty much put their armies into mothballs. Germany, on the other hand, was gearing up for war. They knew this would put a considerable strain on Germany's foreign currency reserves. Another goal involved scouting out Antarctica to locate possible locations for German naval bases. December 17, 1938, the Swabia expedition left Hamburg for Antarctica aboard the MS Schwabenland. The Schwabenland was a Hanse liner of 8,500 registered tons. It was built in 1925 and later was converted into a catapult ship. The ship had a catapult installed on the ship's stern, along with a crane for lifting aircraft. The Schwabenland's twin diesel screws gave it a top speed of 12 knots, or 14 miles an hour. The ship sailed in secret from Hamburg, carrying a complement of 82 men and 2 seaplanes. The planes would be launched by catapult and then touch down in the water. The ship contacted the German whaling fleet off Bouvet Island, and then they anchored near the edge of the pack ice at Princess Martha Coast, in an area which has been claimed by the Norway. They called it Queen Maud Land. The Germans began charting the region and exploring the coast. Queen Maud does not sound very Norwegian. I got to wondering where this name came from. She was known as Maud of Wales, as in Great Britain. She was also known as the Queen of Norway, after she married King Haakon VII. She was the youngest daughter of the British King Edward VII and Alexandra of Denmark. Maud of Wales was the first Queen of Norway in over 5 centuries who was not also the Queen of Denmark and Sweden. I always wonder how a bunch of people, at some point in the past, suddenly discovered that they were the kings and queens of the world. All the royal people are related. During World War I, King George V, or George Frederick Ernest Albert of Great Britain, and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany were cousins. Nazi German flags were placed on the sea ice along the coast. They renamed the area New Schwabenland after the ship. The crew established a temporary base, and in the following weeks they walked along the coast recording claim reservations on hills and other significant landmarks. 7 flights were made by the ship's 2 air seaplanes. They took dozens of photographs as they flew over the ice. The air crews also dropped aluminum markers that were about 12 inches long, kind of shaped like an arrow. These markers were adorned with swastikas and were supposed to show the area claimed by Germany, kind of like a bunch of fence posts. The idea was everything between those markers and the coast belonged to Germany. 8 more flights were made to areas of keen interest, and on these trips, some of the photos taken were color film. Back then, few color photos were taken due to the cost of the film and developing. They flew over hundreds of thousands of square miles and took more than 16,000 aerial photographs. Many of the photos were published after the war by Reicher. The ice-free Schirmacher oasis was spotted from the air by Richard Heinrich Schirmacher. He decided to name it after himself. Shortly after the Schwabenland left the Antarctic coast, February 6, 1939. Today, this area is the home to the Maitri, and oh boy, this is a Russian name, Novolazarevskaya research stations. Maitri is India's second permanent Antarctic station in Antarctica. It was built and finished in 1989 after the first station, Dakshina Gangatori, was buried in ice and abandoned. Novolazarevskaya station is a Russian Antarctic research station. Doesn't that sound like fun? Let's go sit in the ice, freeze to death, and see if we can't figure out what's going on. It's funny, I talked about coincidences a little while ago. As I was working on this show, I was also reading a book to relax and unwind late at night, and don't you know, the book I was reading just happened to be about Antarctica and these giant creatures attacking people and killing them. I believe it was called Ice Beasts. I'll have to look. It was a pretty good book, but I wouldn't let my kids read it. The Norwegian government learned about the expedition through reports from whalers along the coast of Queen Maud Land. Although some, Norwegian writer Jorn Agard and German geographer Ernst Hermann, said that the Germans were never actually on that piece of territory, it is well documented that Germany issued a decree about the establishment of a German Antarctic sector called New Swabia after the expeditions returned in August 1939. I think they just didn't want anybody to think there was anything going on down there. There is a story saying that while the Germans were on the Antarctic shore, they discovered a warm stream coming from the ice. The crew opened the area up around the warm water and found the river flowed from deep inside the continent. It was supposed to go 20 to 30 miles inland, and it came from a geothermal lake. Once the Swabenland was back in Germany, other ships were sent south with equipment to turn the geothermal lake into a small city. The construction was done using laborers who weren't really too keen on being down there, but they didn't have a choice. The whole thing was controlled by the SS. Once completed, the construction was named Base 211, or some called it New Berlin. The Germans either found abandoned alien technology, or they made contact with extraterrestrials living beneath the ice. These were described as being either greys or reptilians, or maybe both. Working with these aliens, the Nazis were able to reconstruct some of the flying discs the aliens were using. As the world entered World War II, the trips to and from the Antarctic had to be done using U-boats or merchant raiders. As the war was slowly turning away from the Germans, they began shipping gold and technology to their base in Antarctica and in Argentina. Even with the advanced technology of the aliens, the weapons were not ready to be used during World War II. It didn't matter that the Germans had flying saucers or anti-gravity devices. They didn't have the ability to use any of it. You would have to train people to fly the craft, and the scientists would need a lot of time to figure out how to turn a traveling vehicle into a fighting weapon. If you found a lightsaber laying on the ground, you wouldn't automatically become a Jedi. You'd probably wind up missing a few fingers and one foot. A General Kammler was in charge of the most highly guarded and top priority development in all of Germany. He had a secret base near the Czech border, buried deep in the ground in the Winkelschloss mine. Winkelschloss, as in King Winchelsloss. The mine was surrounded with 3 defensive rings. At this time, Berlin only had 2. The SS facility was known as Der Reis, or the German. Try that again. The Giant. Now, Deutschland is German. That's why you hear a lot of people refer to something, a group of people, as Pennsylvania Dutch. They're not Dutch. They don't come from Holland. They're German. But when you ask a German where he's from, he will say Deutschland. And that's why the Pennsylvania Dutch are called that. The Lost Dutchman's mine was not found by a Dutchman. It was found by a German. Once again, they said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Deutschland." And so they said, okay, he's the Dutchman. Well, they were working at this facility called the Giant. They were working on the Glock, or the bell. At the end of the war, General Kammler vanished without a trace. He left behind all of the scientists who had been working on his secret project. They were all dead. Possibly he flew to South America and from there to Antarctica. U-864 was sunk while trying to slip out of France, right at the end of the war. In 2003, an ROV went down to the wreck to see if there was anything salvageable. The ROV found a cast iron bottle that contained mercury. Still remaining on board the sub were 1,857 bottles, all containing mercury. The sub was holding about 65 tons of this deadly substance. Why was Germany smuggling mercury out of the country, and where was it headed? 2 months after the Germans surrendered, a German U-boat, U-530, entered the Argentine naval base at Mar del Plata after escaping from Germany before the end of the war. Why sail all the way to Argentina, 7,600 miles, when they could simply surrender at any port? The only possible explanation would be they were carrying something, or someone, that needed to be delivered to a place the Allies were unable to search. Argentina declared war on Germany the last month of 1945, just before Germany surrendered. I think it was more of a publicity stunt than anything else. Argentina is about 2,000 miles from New Swabia. A U-boat could have sailed to Antarctica, dropped off some secret cargo, and then sailed to South America to give up, saving having to make their way all the way back home. I'm just guessing that New Swabia was not any kind of a paradise. It was probably a very utilitarian complex used to build and house war equipment. Being the Führer, I doubt Hitler would have much cared for living in a cold, hostile place where he would have been right at home while living in Argentina. Perhaps he stopped off at Base 211 just to wave to his minions and press the flesh with the higher-ups. Then he and his new bride, Eva Braun, would want to head to a warmer location, someplace where they could walk in the forests and enjoy the sunshine, someplace where they didn't have to worry about the Allies. Recently released FBI documents show that not only was Hitler and Eva Braun's suicide faked, the infamous pair might have had help from the director of the OSS himself, Alan Dulles. The bodies found burned by the Führer bunker were ID'd using dental records that had been hand-drawn from memory by the dental technician that had worked for Hitler's dentist. Does that sound like really good evidence? In one FBI document from Los Angeles, it is revealed that the agency was well aware of a mysterious submarine making its way up the Argentine coast and then dropping off high-level Nazi officials. The FBI knew Hitler was alive and living in South America. A letter to the Bureau from August 1945 is sent from the Los Angeles office. An unidentified informant agreed to exchange information for political asylum. The informant not only knew Hitler was in Argentina, he was one of the 4 men who had met the German submarine. Arrangements had been made for a rowboat to meet the submarine. The 2 submarines had stopped off the coast of Argentina in a secluded bay, and Hitler and Eva Braun were on board the second boat. The Argentinian government not only welcomed the former German dictator, but they aided in his hiding. The informant went on to give detailed directions to the villages that Hitler and his party had passed through, along with physical details concerning Hitler. After World War II, thousands of Nazis and wartime collaborators from France, Croatia, Belgium, and other parts of Europe, those folks who worked with the Nazis against their fellow countrymen, were looking for a new home, someplace as far away from the Nuremberg trials as possible. Argentina welcomed hundreds, if not thousands, of them. The plans had been put in place years before it was needed. Having experienced what might happen when you lose, the Nazis had greased the rails all the way to South America. Juan Domingo Perón's regime went to great lengths to get the war criminals safely installed in his country. He went as far as to sending agents to Europe to ease their passage, providing travel documents and in many cases even covering their expenses. Some of the absolute worst people on earth were being slipped into Argentina and given new identities. Ante Pavelic ran the Croatian regime that murdered hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies. Dr. Joseph Mengele was known as the Angel of Death. He was the doctor that was in charge of sorting out the new arrivals at Auschwitz. He also conducted experiments on his patients. He was fascinated by twins. He wanted to know if you did something really nasty and horrible to one twin, would the other twin have a reaction? Adolf Eichmann was known as the architect of the Holocaust. He was allowed to walk around the country as well as work, as if all of his crimes had never happened. Why on earth would Argentina want these men in their country? To begin with, they brought a boatload of gold and valuable artwork. Argentina was flooded with valuables looted from all over Europe. The death camps were more than just places to destroy people. They ran an efficient machine for squeezing every drop of value out of those sent there before killing them. Most Argentinians were of Spanish, Italian, or German descent. They supported Germany right up until the last days of the war, and then they put on a show of pretending to declare war on them. The second reason so many criminals were brought to South America was power. Perón wanted to build a powerful army. He was promised all the knowledge and experience gained from fighting 2 world wars. And never mind, Germany had lost both. And with that, I'm going to take a brief pause and play some commercials and drink some coffee. So don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. Coffee makes the world go round. And around here, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle Del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. Now, that's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back. By 1945, as the Allies were mopping up the last remains of the Axis, it was clear that the next great conflict would come between the United States and their allies and the USSR. Perón and some of his advisors predicted that World War III would break out as soon as 1948, and he wanted to be on the winning side. Perón was banking on all the war crimes would be forgotten in the rush to combat the Soviets. In a way, he was right. Just look at how many war criminals were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. President Truman said no Nazis were to be brought to our country. Nevertheless, officials within the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, which was the forerunner to the CIA, bypassed this directive by eliminating any incriminating evidence of possible war crimes for the scientists' records. They thought these criminals had intelligence that might be crucial to the country's post-war efforts. People that had been directly involved in the murders of thousands of people were allowed to come into our country. Germany's Navy Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz said, "The German submarine fleet is proud of having built for the Führer in another part of the world a Shangri-La on land, an impregnable fortress." Recently discovered Kriegsmarine archives indicate that more than 40 boats are unaccounted for. All of these boats were late construction, a state-of-the-art craft, and could have made either Argentina or Antarctica completely submerged. The Allied technology at the end of World War II was not capable of locating and tracking these advanced U-boats. General Eisenhower said he believed that Hitler had escaped Germany and was living in Argentina. 1945, the British knew that the Germans had a base in Antarctica. The Allies had determined that there were 250,000 Germans unaccounted for. These men were listed as being in the military, but nobody could figure out where they were. As a search was begun to locate all these missing men, it became a possibility that they might still be actively working to keep the Third Reich alive. Where could so many men be hiding? Many began to look to Antarctica as being the place to look. So, the British Navy set out to remove any Nazis from New Swabenland. Well, this didn't go as planned because the Nazis had been working for years to create an impregnable fortress. When it became obvious Britain needed help prying the Germans loose from their new home, they turned to their ally, the United States. The U.S. launched Operation Highjump in 1946 to try to destroy the German base. Operation Highjump was officially called the United States Navy Antarctic Development Program. It was slated to run from 1946 to 1947, about a year. The U.S. Navy operation had been organized by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, who was the overall officer in charge of Task Force 68. Rear Admiral Richard Cruzen was the commander of Task Force 68 ships and personnel. The task force included 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. They claimed their primary mission was to establish an Antarctic research base called Little America 4. They brought an awful lot of firepower just to build a base. On February 19, 1947, Admiral Byrd took off to fly to the South Pole. He made his destination by about 10 o'clock and then turned north on his return flight. In his journal, he documented his flight. He said, "We are crossing over a small mountain range and still proceeding northward as best as we can ascertain. Beyond the mountain range is what appears to be a valley with small river or streams running through the center portion. There should be no green valley below. Something is definitely wrong and abnormal here. We should be over ice and snow. To the port side are great forests growing on the mountain slopes. Our navigational instruments are still spinning. The gyroscope is oscillating back and forth." Well, Admiral Byrd managed to make it back to the task force after seeing such bizarre things. Task Force 68 was supposed to be in the Antarctic for a year, but after just 8 weeks, they pulled out. Byrd's expedition ended after many fatalities, according to the news reports, based on interviews with crew members who spoke to the press while passing through Chilean ports. One of the news stories came from John Sizewak, a radio man stationed on the USS Brownson. He told how UFOs appeared suddenly popping out of the ocean depths. This happened on January 17, 1947 at 0700 hours. The Sizewich said, "I and my shipmates in the pilot house port side observed for several minutes the bright lights that had ascended about 45 degrees into the sky very quickly. We couldn't ID the lights because our radar was limited to 250 miles in a straight line." Over the next several weeks, the UFOs flew over the U.S. naval flotilla. The crews fired on the UFOs, but were unable to hit them due to their speed and maneuverability. Then the flying discs began firing back, which had a devastating effect. The craft were armed with energy weapons that caused massive damage. According to Lieutenant John Sierson, he was a flying boat pilot, he said, "The thing shot vertically out of the water at tremendous velocity, as though pursued by the devil, and flew between the masts of the ships at such a high speed that the radio antenna oscillated back and forth in its turbulence. An aircraft from the Currituck that took off just a few minutes later was struck by an unknown type of ray from the object and almost instantly crashed into the sea near our vessel. About 10 miles away, the torpedo boat Maddox burst into flames and began to sink. Having personally witnessed this attack by the object that flew out of the sea, all I can say is it was frightening." Rather than deny the heavy casualty reports, Admiral Byrd revealed in a press interview that Task Force 68 had encountered a new enemy that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. When it became obvious that the U.S. Navy was outgunned, Admiral Byrd brought the mission to an end and the fleet set sail for calmer waters. In need of repairs and relief for the men, the fleet put in at ports in Chile. The Navy had to account for the loss of ships and men, so they changed the dates on any reported fatalities to show the incidents took place during the war. There's no record of what happened once Operation Highjump had left Antarctica. Just speculation on my part. I would think some bureaucrat in Washington sent word to the Nazis that if they would share some of their newfound toys, the U.S. would act as if there was nothing going on down there. Operation Paperclip was in full swing, and this kind of thing isn't beyond the bizarre things going on. At the time of Operation Highjump, James Forrestal was the Secretary of the Navy. The official story is that Forrestal became unstable due to overwork. He started talking about all sorts of things, like the secret cabals controlling the Earth and such. He said there was a secret base in Antarctica. Forrestal was declared insane and locked up at Bethesda Naval Hospital. His family tried to get him released, and they were forced to sue the government to get him out. The family won their lawsuit, and they were told that they could pick James up from the hospital on May 22nd, 1949. Early on the morning of May 22nd, James Forrestal is supposed to have tied a belt from his robe around a heater and around his neck, and then he jumped out of the 16th floor window. His body was found on a ledge below. Around the window he was supposed to have jumped from were scratches and scuff marks, as if someone, maybe Forrestal, had been fighting for their life. The corpsman assigned to guard Forrestal had been found AWOL. It was reported he was found drunk later on. Corpsman Harrison was a new man assigned at the last minute. Forrestal had never seen this man before. Harrison was the only person to have had direct contact with Forrestal in the moments before his death, and ultimately it was his word alone that the official account was conceived. Meanwhile, Forrestal's personal diaries, consisting of 15 loose-leaf binders, totaling 3,000 pages, were removed from his former office and brought to the White House, where they remained for the next year. The White House later claimed that Forrestal had requested Truman take custody of the diaries, which sounds odd since Forrestal and Truman had had a falling out a year before. A priest that was visiting the hospital, Father Sheehay, had reason to suspect murder. When he arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital after learning of Forrestal's death, a hospital corpsman approached him through the crowd. The corpsman did the old look over the shoulder, and then he got in close and he said in a very tense voice, "Father, you know Mr. Forrestal didn't kill himself, don't you?" Before Sheehy could respond or ask him any questions, the crowd began moving in close, and this caused the corpsman to stop talking and quickly leave. Did you watch Hunting Hitler? Hunting Hitler came out in November 2015 and ran for a few years. It was a History Channel television series based on the idea that Adolf Hitler escaped from the Führer bunker in Berlin at the end of World War II. They looked into how he might have done so and where he may have gone. The show was conceived due to the recent declassification of FBI documents exploring whether Hitler might still have been alive in the late 1940s. If you watched the show, you couldn't help but become convinced that Hitler did not shoot himself towards the end of World War II, and great steps had been taken to create a Fourth Reich in South America. As I was growing up, the story that Hitler was still alive was being talked about by a lot of people, especially when Adolf Eichmann had been captured in Argentina in 1960. Being me, I asked my teachers about whether or not Hitler was dead. Of course, they all said he'd killed himself in 1945. They wanted to believe this. Well, then I began to read. I read books on ghosts, Bigfoot, UFOs, and conspiracies that a lot of folks said weren't real. Like who actually shot JFK? Or did we really land on the moon? Terry Pratchett said, "The trouble with having an open mind, of course, is that people will insist on coming along and trying to put things into it. The hard part is deciding what should or should not be allowed into your mind." In 1962, Albert Bender wrote Flying Saucers and the Three Men. Bender had been an Air Force veteran during World War II, and he was the founder of the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He believed that he had been abducted by aliens on several occasions during the 50s. During one of his abductions, Bender said he was taken to a secret underground facility in Antarctica. Once he was there, he saw giant landing strips used by UFOs. He met with the base commander, a descendant of the reptilians who had built the base. The commander told Bender the base had been carved out by machines incorporating metal structures into the ice. Bender claimed he was cold at first, but with the help of alien technology, his body quickly acclimated. Hey, I just made up a new word. Quickly acclimated. While there, he was told about the history of the base that had been there for nearly 200 years. Bender learned that he wasn't the first to visit the reptilians in Antarctica. In the months leading up to World War II, a German vessel, the Schwabenland, carried out an expedition to Antarctica. During this expedition, it is said that the Nazis first met the aliens that would help them develop new technologies for the war. It is unclear whether or not the reptilians knew the true intentions of the people they were working with. Well, think about it. If a group of people meet up with beings from another planet, are the aliens going to say, "Welcome to our lair. We're going to invite others from other parts of this planet, and we're going to check just to make sure you're the good guys"? Or does it make sense the aliens would just work with the first people they encountered? Maybe the reptilians liked what the Nazis were doing. How can we know? We think like humans, while aliens would find this an abstract concept. There are some who say the Nazis and the CIA struck a deal in which they would work side by side along with the aliens to use alien technology to advance their own agendas, while allowing the rest of the world to think that Base 211 never existed. 1959, Antarctica was declared a safe zone by the Antarctic Treaty, which stated it was a zone of scientific cooperation and research. This meant that no nuclear missiles or bombs could target Antarctica. You do know what a treaty is, right? It's a piece of paper with a bunch of writing on it that has absolutely no effect on anyone. How many treaties have been signed and ignored over the years? Just about every one of them was just a piece of paper that made folks sleep good at night, thinking their world was safe and on the right course. In February 1999, a Navy flight engineer who was stationed in Antarctica spotted something that lends credence to the story. He was stationed at McMurdo Station when he saw UFOs on several occasions. They moved with unheard of speed and made turns impossible for anything we had at the time or even now. One day, the crew he was with was sent on an emergency flight to Davis Camp. The shortest route of travel was right through a no-fly zone. The cover story was there was an air sampling station in the vicinity, and planes were not allowed to fly through this area because they would mess up the data. When people's lives are on the line, you have to do what you can, so they went right over the supposed air sampling site. As the crew was passing over the center of the no-fly zone, they looked down and they saw a huge opening that went deep into the ground. The opening was about 300 feet in circumference, like the size of a football field. Once the emergency had been handled, the plane was told to fly around the area and then report for debriefing. The folks in charge wanted to know what they'd seen and what they thought about it. Later on, during his time in Antarctica, the crew were dispatched to a camp to see why the scientists there were not responding to radio calls. The plane set down near the camp and the crew set out to investigate. All the equipment was still at the location, but nobody was around. All the scientists were missing. There was no place they could have gotten to, and it was way too far for them to walk to any of the other sites. After a long and unproductive search, the plane returned to McMurdo to file their reports. It was pretty much accepted that the scientists were all dead since they could not survive on the ice without shelter. A few days went by, and a call came in from the outstation. The scientists were all back, and they wanted a plane to come get them. The crew flew out, picked up all the scientists, and transported them back to McMurdo. Once there, all the scientists were rounded up and hustled into a building away from everybody else. Then a plane landed. It took them away. Nobody was allowed to speak to them while they had been at the station. The cover story was the men that had been missing were all suffering from exposure, and they needed to go to an advanced medical facility and be taken care of. How had they survived on the ice for an entire week without freezing to death? Nobody can explain that. A Navy SEAL who was at the Antarctic station says he encountered an object wedged into the ice that looked like a building or maybe some kind of a ship. He said it had walls that were several feet thick. The door was huge and very thick, but it could be opened simply by pushing it with one finger. Once inside the structure, the walls and the ceiling were lit from inside, but not like anything he'd ever seen before. It looked like they were glowing green from inside, which was a very bizarre form of lighting. There have been several satellite images found that show openings into the ice of the Antarctica. The official story is these are caused by storms, kind of like tornadoes that swirl the snow around and bore down into the ice to the rocks below. This explanation falls apart when some of these holes are not round, but they're square or triangular. As folks have found long skid marks in the snow where something had landed or taken off, leaving a trail in the snow. Researchers recently discovered a massive set of caverns within Mount Erebus. These hollow Antarctic caverns were thermally heated from the inside by a volcano that raises the temperature to about 72 degrees. Well, getting away from the frozen continent, people have reported seeing something odd in the skies. There was a contrail that could be traced from Antarctica all the way north to the North Pole. The only way this could have been formed is if some craft with heat-producing engines was flying from pole to pole in just a few minutes. A contrail is formed when super cold air passes through a hot engine, not to be mistaken for chemtrails, which are something entirely different. A contrail will last about 15 to 20 minutes. Then it will dissipate as the trail cools back down and the moisture is mixed back into the air. The contrail people were seeing was 13,000 miles long. In order to produce a trail that long, that was visible the entire length, the craft would have to have been traveling at 26,000 miles an hour. The SR-71 could fly at just over 2,000 miles an hour, and it's the fastest plane on Earth. People have found some images using Google Earth that show some odd structures in Antarctica. What appears to be the remains of an oval-shaped building that is 400 feet across and appears to have all the hallmarks of being a sizable man-made construction. It looks like a medieval castle with a moat running around it. A satellite imagery clearly shows the structure, which closely resembles the ruins of a once giant building. The image shows a shape that is too symmetrical for nature to have possibly created. No amount of wind could have pushed those rocks into a collection of walls. This would be right up there with saying that wind had caused the carvings on Mount Rushmore, which, can you believe it? There are a few people out there that thought so. I read somewhere a college student had written a paper on how a strong wind had managed to carve the rocks to look like 4 of our past presidents. I thought you went to college to get smarter. Scientists initially thought the discovery in Antarctica could be a sastrugi. Oh boy, there's another new word for you. Sastrugi, which is a natural phenomena formed by years of being battered by strong winds, freezing, and heavy snowfall. If you look for images of sastrugi, okay, I got a cat trying to get on my mixer. If you look for images of sastrugi, you'll see what looks like wind-blown snow in unusual shapes, but you won't see anything that looks like walls of a castle. Sastrugi always form a distinctive shape based on the direction of the wind, and they never appear as a distinct oval. The mystery formation in the satellite images looks man-made. Ancient civilizations have been rumored to have existed in Antarctica for years, but no evidence has ever come to light. Any evidence found has vanished into some secret government vault somewhere. The map, drawn in 1513 by Turkish Admiral Piri Reis, shows what Antarctica would look like without all the ice and snow. The map is without a doubt 600 years old. There's only two ways this map could have been made. Either someone was flying over the continent with a satellite 600 years ago, or somebody drew the first map back when Antarctica was not frozen over. This would have been about 100,000 years ago, or so by best guesstimate. The map shows Antarctica drawn impeccably well, despite it not officially being discovered until 1818. The dome-like structure is not the first discovery to raise questions about advanced ancient civilizations living in the area. There's also a pyramid poking out of the snow, with its distinctive triangular symmetrical shape, which is clearly at odds with the surrounding environment. Leading archaeologist Ashoka Tripathi of the Department of Agriculture at the University of Calcutta believes the images show clear evidence of an ancient human settlement beneath the ice sheet. He said, "These are clearly features of some sort of human-made structure resembling some sort of pyramidal structure. The pattern clearly shows nothing we should expect from natural geomorphology formations found in nature. We clearly have here evidence of human engineering." The only problem is that these photographs were taken in Antarctica under 2 kilometers of ice. That's over a mile. That is clearly the puzzling part. We do not have any explanation as to what made this. These pictures just reflect a small portion of Antarctica's total landmass. There are possibly many other additional sites that are covered over with ice. It just shows us how easy it is to underestimate both the size and scale of past human settlements. I think there's a very good possibility there are alien bases in Antarctica that are being run in conjunction with the shadow government. The thought that aliens are visiting Earth and then flying all the way back to Alpha Centauri each night is laughable. But this is the excuse most deniers will use to supposedly debunk UFO sightings. They can't get here from there, is their mantra. What if, thousands of years ago, UFOs landed on our planet back when Antarctica was free from snow and ice? They dug down under the rocks and built their installations. And then they sat back, watching as the snow fell and man became convinced we were alone in the universe. If you're waiting for the government to come clean and tell the truth, don't bother. The folks we elect to run our country are just there so we think we're in charge. The people running things are the ones really in charge of everything, and they won't tell us anything considered of value to their desired outcome for our planet. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. You may have noticed the Zodiac Killer show is back. I had some long, drawn-out messages with Podomatic and Google. Let me say that again. I had some long, drawn-out messages with Podomatic and Google, and nobody could say what was wrong with the show, so I resubmitted it. I did run the name together so the Zodiac Company wouldn't think I was talking about them. If you have any suggestions for a show that you'd like to hear, send it to me and I'll see what I can do. You can contact me at strangethings. Correction, that's my website. You can contact me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. ARCANAS, ARC and NASA.com. Or you can find the archives of the show at either Podomatic.com or YouTube. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?